Hello, I'm Gus Zuehlke, Director of Faith Formation at St Bavo Church in Mishawaka. Today is a very special day. Today, April 11th, 2023, is the 60th anniversary of the promulgation of this document, Pacem in Terris, by Pope John the 23rd. When I was growing up, he was referred to as Good Pope John. And since then, he has been named a saint. So it's St. John, the Pope St. John the 23rd. This was his last encyclical. He was dying as he wrote it, and he was very, very concerned for the world. And his concern for the world manifested itself in all the diplomacy he worked at, especially to resolve the relationship between President Kennedy and Nikita Khrushchev, the premier of the Soviet Union. In fact, the first person outside the Vatican to read this document, Peace on Earth, and of course, historically, we use the first Latin words when we talk about an encyclical. So the Latin words are Pacem in Terris, but it's known to us in English as Peace on Earth. The first person to have read this outside the Vatican was Nikita Khrushchev. It was delivered to him by a gentleman who was doing like shuttle diplomacy between the Pope, Khrushchev, and Kennedy just after the Cuban Missile Crisis, in order to solidify negotiations that later resulted in test ban treaty, and of course also I'd say in that very dramatic American University address that John F. Kennedy gave on June 10th, 1963, which was a real step forward in peace relationships between the United States and the Soviet Union during that era of great tension. Well, here we are 60 years later, and there are great tensions being raised again between the United States and other powers. And what we're looking at is the need for a peaceful resolution to these problems. And it seems to me that Peace on Earth, this encyclical, contains enough wisdom to look at again, even after 60 years. Church teaching can age with its eternal truths better than any other form of wisdom. And this particular document turned out to be Pope John the 23rd's last will and testament, as it were. And the spirit of this is a father that worries tremendously. He was full of fear that another terrible war would break out. And of course, right now, many people feel afraid of war breaking out. And so in the midst of that, let's look at this wonderful document again and ponder its deep meaning. First of all, when this document came out, there were people that made charges that this document was unrealistic in its vision of hope and naive in its treatment of power. But these charges that were made were later disproved by history. That's what I would say. And what do I mean by that? Well, it is the case that it was this very document that encouraged Nikita Khrushchev and President Kennedy to begin the laborious effort of negotiating the test ban treaty and reducing tensions, the tensions that had resulted prior in the Cuban Missile Crisis. So we have here in Pachamenteras a code whereby people who differ could come together in spite of their differences and work out a living arrangement. And so the perspective of this document, it goes so much deeper than the criticisms that were leveled against it. And so what we want to do is examine the interior structure of this document a little bit to help people recognize its practicality. Okay? The first of all aspect of this document is that it really does elicit a spirit of trust between warring parties. Okay? And the way Pope John the 23rd raises that trust level is first of all by the power of his spiritual fatherhood. You see, his heart was that of a father that did not want to see his children kill each other or live forever in unreconciled relationships. And so he wrote this document from the lofty plane of the way God is the Father of us all. Even when we are at odds with each other, He's our Father. As I said before, this is the last will and testament of a father to his children, and it embodies the Father's wish for enduring peace and well-being in the entire family of mankind. Even if it were not addressed to all men of goodwill, which it was, there could be no question from the text that this document is directed far beyond the visible church. It's addressed with a father's love and urgency to the deepest problems of the world, which are seen by the church today only to the extent that she realizes the social mandates of a Savior who is as much man as he was God. But Pope John was not willing to wait until that day when the church would absorb enough of his Christic love for the whole world to become an effective medium of that love. Pope John loved the world, and he spoke to it directly, not through the cracks in the church's walls. So he's going to address, like giving the document to Khrushchev, he's going to address the world directly. And he's going to embrace the world's needs as a father would his son's needs, in the hope that the church in council would follow him, thus bringing the people of God fully into the family of man. This is Pope John's final message to the only family remaining to him, the whole world. It's a totally nonviolent commitment that he makes. And that is very, very significant. What he says, that force should be repudiated, and that's a constant theme in this document. It could be no other way. To the degree to which a person will justify violence and war is in inverse proportion to the depth of his awareness of the unity and bonds of the human family. Pope John felt that these bonds of worldwide community at the very center of his being in an age of possibly ultimate conflict and destruction. He wrote, "It's hardly possible to imagine in the atomic era war could be used as an instrument of justice." He did not reject violence simply because he lived in an age of nuclear weapons, however, because no loving father can tolerate the threat of murder among his sons. And nuclear weapons made that murderous threat more massive and more likely. That's the immense suffering which the use of these armaments would bring to the human family, which he cites as the immediate grounds for his judgment on war. The human family is in the essence of his vision. For him to justify war in any form would have been a denial of his communion with his family. It's when he had reached the summit of his life that the man who no longer had any special ties to this life, he didn't have a family or earthly country or nation, and for whom the whole world was a family, was moved to write his encyclical on peace. He repudiated force, as I mentioned before. He said disagreements among nations must be settled not by force, not by deceit or trickery, but rather in the only manner which is worthy of the dignity of man, by a mutual assessment of the reasons on both sides of the dispute, by a mature and objective investigation of the situation, and an equitable reconciliation of differences of opinion. Now that is a challenge. And it's a challenge he was up to in the way that he negotiated with Kennedy and Khrushchev. And so this document does have practical meaning for our time. I'd like to step back into some of the experiences I've had of peace building and share with you my insights from those. I experienced a war zone for the first time in my life, personally, when I went to northern Uganda in 2003 and went up to the war zone from the capital city. In those days, you couldn't drive up there. The rebels would stop the car, or possibly kidnap you or kill you. So I took the plane up to Gulu, which is in northern Uganda. And a lot of people thought that this visitor from the United States was wrong or crazy to do that. But I made the decision to go up there, and Father Binta, who was my host, agreed to go with me. And of course we saw the effects of that tragic war. We saw the commuter children. We saw the fields from the airplane laid fallow that had caused people to starve. We saw the people trying to talk people out of joining the rebel army. I remember Father Carlos, they called him the fearless one. He was calling out on his cell phone to the people who were in the rebel army to negotiate with them. And of course I met Archbishop Odama, the courageous church leader up there who gathered all the religious groups and the Acholi Religious Leaders Peace Initiative to push for a negotiated solution to that war. And of course, thank God, he was ultimately successful at that. But having seen that, and especially having seen the trauma of the people in the displacement camp in Pagak, which is, I went there, and seeing those people there made a very, very deep impression on me. And I promised myself, and I promised them that if I could get back, I would. I made 2 more trips to the war zone in 2005. And then after my 3rd trip, I started a project to bring internet to the displacement camps. By now, the war had given way to a truce. I did not know how long that truce was going to last, so I rushed the deployment. And in March of 2007, we deployed the first internet connections to 7 locations in what became known as the Bosco Project, battery operated systems for community outreach. It was a peace-building mission, and I was touched by the Lord to pursue peace-building beyond that. And the person who most inspired me was Father Ted Hesper. When he died, I was in grief, and I called a friend up at Notre Dame, and we met over at Notre Dame in the Roars Bar, the Morris Inn, and I proposed the idea of a peace conference in honor of Father Hesper that I would do, in this case, up in Green Bay at the Shrine of Our Lady of Good Help, which is 10 miles north of the city of Green Bay. And we did. And because I was so moved by the testimony of 2 other people, one was I watched these both on YouTube. One was the testimony given by Father Ed Malloy, who's known to the people at Notre Dame as Monk Malloy. He gave the sharing, or the homily at Father Hesburgh's wake service, which was held in Sacred Heart Basilica. And he talked about Father Hesburgh's burden for the problems in the Holy Land. And then I heard Condoleezza Rice speak at the big public service they held in the Athletic and Convocation Center later on, and she shared the same thing about Father Hesburgh's burden for peace and how he shared with her his concerns in that direction, while he was at the same time comforting her over the death of her father. I mean, he was it was very typical, I think, of Father Hesburgh that he could get a couple things done at once. He was ministering to Condoleezza Rice just as another human being who was grieving, and at the same time he was getting his concerns across to her about his burden for peace. These 2 witnesses, from Father Malloy and from Condoleezza Rice, spoke to my heart, and I said, I got to do that peace conference. So I gathered a Israeli and a Palestinian and Archbishop John the Baptist of Dama and the priest that helped me start the Bosco Project, that's Father Okumo, and we put together a conference that included troubled cities in our land. And of course, because I was from South Bend, I brought a number of people from South Bend, but I also brought people from Milwaukee, from Baltimore, and from Ferguson. And it was called Healing America's Wounds a moral vision of reconciliation. And we heard the testimony of these peace activists from the Holy Land, and we heard the testimony of Archbishop Odama about his take on building peace, and then there were sharings throughout this 2-day conference. And at the end of that 2-day conference, the priest, Monsignor Jack from Ferguson, who had been there in Ferguson during the Troubles, he said, "Why don't you hold the next conference in the West Bank?" And I had no idea how that was going to work. But within a year, a group of us were in the West Bank, and we were holding a conference in the village of Nabi Saleh. And that's why I have this statue here. You see, I asked a sculptor from Mishawaka, which is of course where I minister at St Bavo's, to cast a statue that represented Mary holding 2 dead soldiers who were on both sides of a conflict. So it could have been the rebels in the Ugandan government, which is what the statue was originally designed for. But by the time I had proposed this statue, he was working on it. I was already going to travel to the Holy Land, and so I told him I wanted it for that. And he gave me a statue, and I carried it on the airplane, and I brought it to Nabi Saleh. And so the 2 soldiers ended up being a Palestinian and an Israeli. And you can see her holding here, in her great sorrow, the 2 dead soldiers, the 2 people who died in the conflict. And as part of our visit to the Holy Land, we did portraits of people who had died in the conflict there on both sides. We did Israeli soldiers, and we did Palestinians who had died in the conflict. And we did our peace conference in Nabi Saleh. Well, I bring this statue here today for another reason, however. The reason is that the statue, I gave it the title of Mater Misericordiae. That's Latin for Mother of Mercy. But if you look at what Pope Francis says about mercy in his book, The Name of God is Mercy, he reminds us that misericordiae can be literally translated as miserable heart. And when I gave this statue to the Palestinians in Nabi Saleh, I quoted a prominent Israeli, Nurit Peled, who had lost her beloved 13-year-old daughter to 2 Palestinian suicide bombers in a Jerusalem mall. And when she was asked by some people to be allowed to use her situation to call down revenge on the Palestinians, she spoke up and said, "Don't ever talk to me of revenge," she said, "because no mother would want any other mother to suffer the way I'm suffering." And so her heart was broken and miserable, but she didn't want to pass that misery along. And so she, in her words, were emblazoned on my memory and my heart when I went to the Palestinians and gave them this statue. The one I gave them happens to be white. This one is done in dark patina. But the issue is it's the same statue. And what I learned from this is that the trauma of war is the first thing we've got to deal with. And that gave me an insight trauma is what we've got to deal with. Can we, without judging either side, just enter into the trauma of both people that died on either side? I think that would be the first step. And it seems to me to be the first step that, for example, Pope Francis took in reference to the situation in the Ukraine back in February of 2022, when he announced soon after the beginning of the Russian incursion into Ukraine, the fact that he was consecrating both Russia and the Ukraine to the Immaculate Heart of Mary, to the heart of the miserable mother, the mother that embraces both sides. And somehow in her Immaculate Heart, Mary bears the sword of trauma. The sword, it pierces her heart for all the thousands of people who have already died, say, in that war, or the people who are dying in the Middle East right now, or to the threatened situation, say, in Taiwan right now. There's a threatened situation. There's a ramping up of tensions. Or the situation in the South Sudan, or the situation in Yemen, or the situation in Syria. All these places. But certainly we go back to the thoughts of our brothers and sisters in the Ukraine and Russia, and remember that we start by confronting honestly their trauma without jumping to tribal allegiances to start. We look, as Pope John the 23rd in his wisdom said, to a mutual assessment of reasons on both sides of the dispute by a mature and objective investigation of the situation and by an equitable reconciliation of difference of opinion. My brothers and sisters, I don't see many people willing to follow the wisdom of Pope John the 23rd, the wisdom that can lead us to nonviolent resolutions of these problems. Too often, we jump from the trauma to the tragedy of geopolitics. And the geopolitics, as you know, historically, is filled with tragedy. And I would, in reference to the Ukraine, I would recommend that we look carefully at the historical antecedents of the problems that arose in February of 2022 and face them as traumas first, and then evaluate the geopolitics of the situation. I would suggest that you follow this line for the Ukrainian situation. Start with Mary and her heart reaching out to both Russians and Ukrainians. Then go to Mearsheimer and watch his YouTube video. Last time I saw it, it had 27 million views. I believe he gave that lecture at the University of Chicago in 2015, and it's entitled "The Ukraine Situation is the West's Fault." Now, and it got millions and millions of views for an academic lecture. That's pretty incredible. So, and remember, who is John Mearsheimer? He's an expert on geopolitics and an expert on international relations. And he's taught at the University of Chicago for years. And I guess he was in military service before that for the United States. He's a realist. He's known as a tragic realist. Well, start with the trauma being held and being absorbed by the heart of the mother. Think of, again, of Nurit Pellet. And then move to the tragedy of geopolitics, as given an account of by Mearsheimer. And then be bold and look for solutions. And let me recommend that you listen to the Columbia, I think he's from Columbia University, Jeffrey Sachs. And he's done a video on YouTube that's about the geopolitics of peace. And then there was a lecture given by the Jesuit Father Spadero. I think he's a bishop too, or archbishop. Forgive me, I can't remember. I was even at the lecture at Notre Dame. And that lecture was given, quite a while ago. But it's called Pope Francis and the Geopolitics of Mercy. And in that lecture, what you're going to see is the drawing out of church wisdom that can lead to a wise resolution of these problems. See, people think that the church and its theology is not realistic. This is what they said about John the 23rd, when he was actually, history shows that he had actually resolved, as best he could, the difference between Kennedy and Khrushchev. He didn't know. He died not knowing. But over time, Khrushchev listened to him, Kennedy listened to him, and if you have any question about that, think about what Kennedy said in the American University address about peace. I cannot emphasize enough how important that particular address is. The reason being that it's a commencement address that Kennedy gave. I believe it was June 10th of 1963. And he advanced the notion that people who were different and had different approaches to geopolitics could still get along. He says, what kind of peace do I mean? What kind of peace do we seek? Not a Pax Americana enforced on the world by American weapons of war. Not the peace of the grave or the security of the slave. I'm talking about genuine peace. The kind of peace that makes life on earth worth living. The kind that enables men and nations to grow and to hope and to build a better life for their children. Not merely peace for Americans, but peace for all men and women. Not merely peace in our time, but peace for all time. I speak of peace, he says later on, therefore, as the necessary rational end of rational men. I realize that the pursuit of peace is not as dramatic as the pursuit of war, and frequently the words of the pursuer fall on deaf ears. But we have no more urgent task. Some say that it's useless to speak of world peace, or world law, or world disarmament, and that it'll be useless until the leaders of the Soviet Union adopt a more enlightened attitude. I hope they do. I believe we can help them do it. But I also believe that we must re-examine our own attitudes as individuals and as a nation. For our attitude is as essential as theirs. And every graduate of this school, every thoughtful citizen who despairs of war and wishes to bring peace, should begin by looking inward, by examining his own attitude toward the possibilities of peace, toward the Soviet Union, toward the course of the Cold War, and toward freedom and peace here at home. And, he goes on. And I need to emphasize that with such a peace, he says, there will still be quarrels and conflicting interests as they are within families and nations. World peace, like community peace, does not require that each man love his neighbor. It requires only that they live together in mutual tolerance, submitting their disputes to a just and peaceful settlement. And history teaches us that enmity between nations, as between individuals, do not last forever. However, fixed our likes and dislikes may seem, the tide of time and events will often bring surprising changes in the relations between nations and neighbors. And he says here, this is kind of the summary paragraph that I always liked. I printed it up on Facebook before. So let us not be blind to our differences, but let us also direct attention to our common interests and to the means by which those differences can be resolved. And if we cannot end now our differences, at least we can help make the world safe for diversity. For in the final analysis, our most basic common link is that we all inhabit the same small planet. We all breathe the same air. We all cherish our children's future, and we are all mortal. You can see the echo of Pope John the 23rd's deep concern for peace in what President Kennedy said a week after he died at the American University. And I think we just really need to move in the direction of the spirit of that talk. And I noticed that when Jeffrey Sachs spoke on peace, on the geopolitics of peace, he quoted Kennedy as well. So, dear friends, can I recommend something? Can you pray for peace today on the 60th anniversary of the promulgation of this wonderful text, Peace on Earth by John the 23rd? Can you recognize the need to tell the truth, the whole truth, nothing but the truth? What I mean by that is everybody has a right to be truthfully informed about public events. Can we look at our differences again and make peace rather than war? Can we come to each other with a slight seed of humility rather than tribal enmity? I believe that, as a Christian, I believe that Pope John the 23rd, Saint Pope John the 23rd, like we Catholics call him a saint, is praying for us today. And he's hoping that we hear the call of the Lord to truth, to justice, to mutual love, and to freedom. If you want to put this talk in shorthand, think of it this way. Trauma and a sword of war piercing the heart of the Mother of God, of the Mother of Mercies, of the Immaculate Heart of Mary, followed by tragic realism of one of the wisest scholars in America, followed by the beginning of the recommendation of a solution from two other people, from another wise scholar in America, Jeffrey Sachs, and then Pope Francis. Put those together, trauma tragedy, truth, and truthful history. And let's begin again to work toward an honest assessment of both the causes of these conflicts and their solution. And let's let go of our tribal enmity and turn our hatred and our anger over to the heart of God, to the Sacred Heart. Thank you very much.